Hey guys, tonight let's slow everything down a little. Dim the lights, put the phone face down, let the room go quiet. We're going to drift gently through history, not the loud kind with battles and banners, but the soft, uncomfortable kind that mostly happened indoors, behind stone walls, to people who didn't get much of a choice. Tonight, we're talking about girls, very young girls, who were married off for political reasons, because of course they were. And before we go any further, don't worry, this isn't going to be graphic or shocking or emotionally loud. This is sleepless historian territory. Flat, calm, mildly tragic. Perfect background noise for falling asleep while thinking, vaguely, wow, that was rough, before drifting off. So, let's begin. For most of history, especially in royal and noble circles, marriage had absolutely nothing to do with love, or happiness, or consent, or whether the bride had finished growing her adult teeth. Marriage was a contract, a treaty with jewelry, a land deal with a veil. If you were a girl born into a royal family, your life was basically planned out before you could walk, sometimes before you could breathe properly. Your value was measured in alliances, borders, dowries, and whether your womb could eventually produce a male heir, preferably several, preferably without complications, and preferably while staying quiet about it. Child marriage wasn't unusual. It was normal, expected, strategic, and deeply, profoundly inconvenient for the actual child involved. Let's start in medieval Europe, where royal daughters were married off with the same casual efficiency as livestock transfers, except the livestock usually got better living conditions. A princess might be betrothed at the age of 2 or 3, sometimes even younger. The marriage ceremony itself might happen later or immediately, depending on political urgency. If Dad needed an alliance now, then congratulations, you're 6 years old and already married to a man in his 30s who smells like horse. Of course, they'd say things like, the marriage won't be consummated until she comes of age, which sounds reassuring until you realize that of age could mean 12 or even 11, because medieval biology was vibes-based at best. Let's gently float over to one of the most common outcomes for these girls, relocation. A child bride rarely stayed in her home country. She was shipped off, sometimes literally, across borders, seas, and languages to live with strangers who had zero emotional investment in her well-being. She'd arrive in a new court, unable to speak the language, surrounded by adults who saw her as a future function, not a person. Imagine being 8 years old, handed over like a diplomatic parcel, and expected to smile politely while everyone congratulates themselves on the alliance. If she was lucky, and that's a very generous use of the word, she might be allowed to live separately from her husband until puberty. If she was unlucky, she was expected to start playing the role immediately, learning court etiquette, observing adult dynamics, sitting quietly while grown men discussed her future pregnancies like crop yields. Education for these girls was inconsistent. Some were taught to read, write, pray, and manage a household. Others were almost taught nothing, because why bother educating a body meant for reproduction? Intellectual curiosity was not considered an asset in a queen, unless it could be weaponized diplomatically. And then there was the pressure, constant, suffocating, softly spoken but relentless. Produce an heir, preferably a son, preferably quickly, preferably without dying. Let's talk about bodies for a moment, calmly, medically, sleepily. A child's body is not designed for pregnancy. Medieval people didn't understand this scientifically, but they understood it anecdotally.
Girls married at 12 or 13 had terrifyingly high rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, internal injury, and death, but those outcomes were treated as unfortunate inconveniences, not reasons to stop the practice. If a girl died in childbirth, she was mourned briefly, buried quietly, and replaced strategically. The alliance mattered more than the individual, always. And if she survived but failed to produce a male heir, things got tense. Let's drift into the emotional side of this, because it's quieter and somehow worse. Many of these girls grew up in total emotional isolation. They were surrounded by people, constantly observed, constantly managed, but rarely loved. Their husbands were often much older, emotionally distant, sometimes openly hostile. Romantic affection was not expected. Compliance was. If she complained, she was told to endure. If she resisted, she was punished. If she failed, she was blamed. Because that's the fun thing about royal marriages. Nothing is ever the king's fault.
Let's float over to one of history's favorite coping mechanisms for these women: religion. Many child brides turned to intense religious devotion, not necessarily out of spiritual calling, but because it was the only socially acceptable emotional outlet. Prayer was safe. Piety was praised. Suffering was framed as holy. If you were miserable, that was fine. If you were obedient, even better. If you were unhappy, that meant you were doing it right. Some queens became known for extreme fasting, excessive prayer, or self-denial. Modern historians sometimes describe them as deeply devout, which is one way of saying this was the only control she had over her own body. Others coped by withdrawing emotionally. They became distant, flat, unreactive, which honestly is a very understandable response when your entire existence is a political function. Now let's gently acknowledge something else without lingering too much. Many of these women were children raising children. A girl married at 12 might be expected to produce heirs by 14. By 16, she could be responsible for multiple pregnancies, infant deaths, and court expectations, while still technically a teenager. If her children died, which they often did, she was blamed for weak blood, poor constitution, or divine punishment. Never mind sanitation, never mind genetics, never mind the fact that medieval medicine was mostly guesswork and prayers. It was always her fault. And if she survived into adulthood, her identity was often permanently frozen in the role she'd been forced into as a child. She was never allowed to become someone else. Her personality was shaped around compliance, vigilance, and emotional restraint. Let's pause here and gently point out the irony. These women were often queens, duchesses, empresses. They wore crowns, sat on thrones, had servants kneeling before them, and yet they had less control over their own lives than most peasants. A peasant woman might choose her partner, might work, might live within a familiar community, might have emotional support. A royal child bride had none of that. Her marriage was arranged, her movements restricted, her body monitored, her worth conditional. Power is a funny thing like that. Now, before we drift into the next segment later on, because we will continue, slowly, calmly, relentlessly, let's end part 1 by talking about survival. Some of these women did survive, not just physically, but politically. A few learned how to navigate court life with quiet intelligence. They built alliances, protected their children, occasionally influenced policy from behind the scenes. They didn't rebel openly, That would have ended badly, but they adapted. Their strength wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic in the cinematic sense. It was subtle, persistent, exhausting. And most importantly, it was never meant to be necessary. So as we settle into the rest of this story, keep that image in mind. A child dressed as a bride, surrounded by adults congratulating themselves, smiling because it's expected, and slowly realizing that this isn't a visit, this is permanent. And now, on to part 2. Let's ease back in. If you're just joining, welcome back. Get comfortable again. Adjust the pillow. Nothing loud is about to happen, just more history quietly being unpleasant. When we left off, we were with a child bride who has just arrived at her new court. She's wearing clothes chosen by other people, smiling because it's expected, and slowly realizing that this isn't a visit, this is permanent. Now comes the long middle part of her life. The waiting, the watching, the being observed like a very expensive future asset.
One of the strangest things about growing up married in a royal court is that nothing really belongs to you. Not your time, not your body, not even your childhood. Every stage of development is monitored. When you eat, when you bleed for the first time, when your body changes. All of it is noticed, discussed, and quietly reported to people who are very invested in what happens next. Puberty wasn't a private moment, it was a political milestone. Once a girl began menstruating, the pressure shifted immediately. The tone of the court changed. Conversations lowered, expectations sharpened. Her value suddenly became urgent, because now she wasn't just a bride, she was a vessel with a schedule. Let's talk about consummation, but in the most boring, least dramatic way possible, which is how history mostly treated it. In many royal marriages, consummation was not a private affair. Witnesses weren't usually in the room, but they were close enough. Bedding ceremonies existed in several cultures, where the couple was escorted to bed, sometimes blessed, sometimes joked about, sometimes awkwardly encouraged. And if the bride was young, very young, this was framed as normal, necessary, God-ordained. If she was frightened, that was ignored. If she cried, that was inconvenient. If she resisted, that was disobedience. Medieval and early modern societies had no meaningful concept of consent within marriage, especially not for girls. Marriage itself was considered consent permanently and retroactively. And once consummation occurred, there was no going back, no escape clause, no reconsideration period. If pregnancy followed, and it often did, the girl was thrown immediately into the dangerous, exhausting cycle of medieval childbirth. Let's drift gently into that. Pregnancy for a royal child bride was not restful. She wasn't tucked away to recover. She was expected to appear in public, follow court etiquette, attend religious services, and continue performing the role of queen in training. Childbirth itself was terrifying at any age, but for girls whose bodies weren't fully developed, it was especially deadly. Narrow hips, fragile bones, weak immune systems, no understanding of infection. Midwives did what they could, which wasn't much. If the baby lived, celebrations followed. If it was a boy, relief spread through the court like a warm blanket. If it was a girl, well, polite disappointment, quickly masked. If the baby died, the mother was expected to recover emotionally almost immediately. There was always another pregnancy waiting. Grief was a luxury. Duty was constant. Now let's talk about blame, because history loved that part. If a girl failed to conceive quickly, she was suspected of being barren, even if she was 14. If she miscarried, it was a sign of weakness. If her children died young, it reflected poorly on her bloodline. No one questioned whether her age, health, or trauma might be involved. That would have required empathy. History was short on that. Meanwhile, her husband, often much older, was rarely scrutinized. Male infertility was barely acknowledged. If there was a problem, it was assumed to be hers, because of course it was. Let's float over to court life for a moment. A royal court was not a supportive environment. It was competitive, gossip-heavy, and deeply political. A young bride was surrounded by older women, ladies-in-waiting, noble women, relatives, some of whom were kind, many of whom were strategic. Everything she did was watched: how she spoke, how she dressed, how she prayed. One wrong word could spark rumors. One perceived failure could be weaponized. And if she came from a foreign land, the scrutiny was worse. Accents were mocked, customs were criticized, food preferences became moral judgments. Foreign queens were blamed for everything that went wrong. Bad harvest, her fault. Sickly air, her fault. Political tension, obviously her fault. Xenophobia paired beautifully with misogyny, a classic combination. Now let's talk about loneliness, because it's quiet and constant. Most child brides were separated from their mothers very early, sometimes permanently. Letters might be exchanged, but travel was difficult, and emotional openness was rare. Their husbands were not companions, they were obligations. Friendships within the court were risky. Trust was dangerous. Confiding in the wrong person could end badly. So many of these girls grew up emotionally isolated, surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. Some coped by becoming rigidly formal. Others leaned into performance, playing the role of perfect queen as a form of self-protection. A few became sharp observers of human behavior, learning how to read a room because survival depended on it. And then there were the girls who broke. History doesn't always record them clearly, but the signs are there. Queens described as melancholic, unstable, overly emotional, or prone to nervous ailments. These were not clinical diagnoses, they were social labels for trauma. Imagine being married before you understood what marriage meant, becoming pregnant before you understood your own body, losing children before you understood death, and being told constantly that this was your purpose. It's not surprising that some women withdrew entirely, or lashed out, or became deeply depressed. But even then, they were expected to continue.
Let's gently move to another layer: replacement. If a child bride died young, and many did, her role didn't disappear. Another girl took her place, sometimes a sister, sometimes a cousin, sometimes another child from another kingdom. The alliance mattered more than the individual, always. This created a strange awareness among surviving girls. They knew they were interchangeable, valuable, but not irreplaceable. That knowledge shapes a person. Now, occasionally, a woman outlived her usefulness as a wife and became something else, a widow. Widowhood could be a strange kind of freedom. If her husband died and she had produced an heir, her position might stabilize. She might act as regent. She might control her own household. She might finally have a voice. But if she had no surviving children, or if her political value had expired, then widowhood could mean exile, or confinement, or forced remarriage, sometimes to another man just as unpleasant. There was no retirement plan for royal women. Let's pause here for a soft irony. History loves to romanticize queens. Paintings show silk gowns, serene expressions, jeweled crowns. They look composed, powerful, timeless. But those portraits were propaganda,
carefully crafted images meant to reassure subjects and intimidate rivals. Behind them were girls who never got to be girls, women who never chose their lives, mothers who buried children and were told to try again. And they were expected to do all of this quietly, gracefully, with dignity, because dignity was the one thing they were allowed to keep, so long as it didn't interfere with politics. As we gently drift toward the next part of this story, we're going to widen the lens a bit. We'll look at specific patterns, specific regions, specific outcomes, not with drama, not with shock, just with that calm, unsettling realization that this wasn't rare, it wasn't exceptional, it was standard operating procedure. So settle back in. In Part 3, we'll float over to the girls who did become mothers of dynasties and what it cost them to get there. Let's ease forward again. Same quiet tone, same slow pace. Nothing sudden, nothing exciting, just history continuing to be quietly exhausting. By this point in our story, the child bride has survived long enough to do the one thing she was raised to do. She has produced an heir, maybe several. And now, finally, she has a role that people respect, mother of the dynasty, which sounds powerful, and technically on paper it is, but in practice it's just another cage with nicer furniture. Once a girl successfully produced a male heir, her immediate value stabilized, the court relaxed slightly, the whispers softened, her position was no longer fragile, just conditional. Because now she wasn't just a wife, she was the future's caretaker. And this is where things get especially strange. These women were often still incredibly young when they became mothers of kings, 16, 17, sometimes younger, and suddenly they were expected to raise a future ruler while still being managed like a child themselves. They were responsible for educating princes in morality, religion, and behavior, but not in politics, not in strategy. Those domains belonged to men. So the Queen Mother was tasked with shaping the soul, but not the mind. She was expected to be nurturing, gentle, pious, and endlessly patient. She was not expected to have opinions, or ambition, or ideas about governance, unless those ideas aligned perfectly with the men around her. And yet, paradoxically, these women were often blamed for how their sons turned out. If a king was cruel, people whispered about her mother's influence. If he was weak, she had coddled him. If he was unstable, she had failed spiritually. Mothers were responsible for everything, except authority. Let's gently move to another layer, replacement. If a child bride died young, and many did, her role didn't disappear. Another girl took her place, sometimes a sister, sometimes a cousin, sometimes another child from another kingdom. The alliance mattered more than the individual, always. This created a strange awareness among surviving girls. They knew they were interchangeable, valuable, but not irreplaceable. That knowledge shapes a person. Now, occasionally, a woman outlived her usefulness as a wife and became something else, a widow. Widowhood could be a strange kind of freedom. If her husband died and she had produced an heir, her position might stabilize. She might act as regent. She might control her own household. She might finally have a voice. But if she had no surviving children, or if her political value had expired, then widowhood could mean exile, or confinement, or forced remarriage, sometimes to another man just as unpleasant. There was no retirement plan for royal women. Let's pause here for a soft irony. History loves to romanticize queens. Paintings show silk gowns, serene expressions, jeweled crowns. They look composed, powerful, timeless. But those portraits were propaganda, carefully crafted images meant to reassure subjects and intimidate rivals. Behind them were girls who never got to be girls, women who never chose their lives, mothers who buried children and were told to try again. And they were expected to do all of this quietly, gracefully, with dignity, because dignity was the one thing they were allowed to keep, so long as it didn't interfere with politics. As we gently drift toward the next part of this story, we're going to widen the lens a bit. We'll look at specific patterns, specific regions, specific outcomes, not with drama, not with shock, just with that calm, unsettling realization that this wasn't rare, it wasn't exceptional, it was standard operating procedure. So settle back in. In Part 3, we'll float over to the girls who did become mothers of dynasties and what it cost them to get there. Let's ease forward again. Same quiet tone, same slow pace. Nothing sudden, nothing exciting, just history continuing to be quietly exhausting. By this point in our story, the child bride has survived long enough to do the one thing she was raised to do. She has produced an heir, maybe several. And now, finally, she has a role that people respect, mother of the dynasty, which sounds powerful, and technically on paper it is, but in practice it's just another cage with nicer furniture. Once a girl successfully produced a male heir, her immediate value stabilized, the court relaxed slightly, the whispers softened, her position was no longer fragile, just conditional. Because now she wasn't just a wife, she was the future's caretaker. And this is where things get especially strange. These women were often still incredibly young when they became mothers of kings, 16, 17, sometimes younger, and suddenly they were expected to raise a future ruler while still being managed like a child themselves. They were responsible for educating princes in morality, religion, and behavior, but not in politics, not in strategy. Those domains belonged to men. So the Queen Mother was tasked with shaping the soul, but not the mind. She was expected to be nurturing, gentle, pious, and endlessly patient. She was not expected to have opinions, or ambition, or ideas about governance, unless those ideas aligned perfectly with the men around her. And yet, paradoxically, these women were often blamed for how their sons turned out. If a king was cruel, people whispered about her mother's influence. If he was weak, she had coddled him. If he was unstable, she had failed spiritually. Mothers were responsible for everything, except authority.
Let's float gently into daily life. A royal mother's day was rigidly structured. Morning prayers, supervised meals, audiences she was allowed to attend, household management, needlework, religious observance, childcare, though much of the physical work was done by nurses and servants. Emotional closeness with her children varied wildly. Some mothers bonded deeply with their sons and daughters. Others barely knew them, especially if political advisors insisted on early separation to toughen future kings. In many courts, royal children were removed from their mothers at a very young age, sometimes before the age of 7, sometimes earlier. This wasn't considered cruel, it was considered practical. Attachment was seen as a weakness. So imagine surviving childhood marriage, surviving childbirth, surviving court politics, only to have your children taken away and raised by strangers while you watch from a polite distance. And imagine being told this was normal. Now let's talk about regency, because occasionally history allowed these women a taste of actual power. If a king died while his heir was still a minor, the mother might become regent, temporarily, carefully, under supervision, always under suspicion. Regent mothers were some of the most scrutinized figures in history. Every decision they made was questioned, every action interpreted as selfish or manipulative. If they succeeded, it was luck. If they failed, it was proof they never should have been trusted. They walked a tightrope between competence and obedience.
Too passive, and they were ineffective. Too assertive, and they were dangerous. And of course, if anything went wrong during a regency, rebellion, famine, scandal, the blame landed squarely on her shoulders, because she was there, and visible, and female. Let's drift to another quiet tragedy: remarriage. Widowed queens, especially young ones, were often pressured to remarry for political reasons. This could mean being married again to another man chosen entirely for strategic value. Sometimes this new husband was hostile. Sometimes he resented her status. Sometimes he resented her children, especially if they weren't his. Blended royal families were not warm environments. A queen mother might find herself trapped between protecting her children from her first marriage and navigating loyalty to a second husband who saw those children as rivals. This is where history gets especially tense, though we'll keep it calm. Step families in royal courts were dangerous: succession disputes, poison rumors, quiet removals, convenient illnesses. And while historians argue endlessly about what really happened, one thing is clear: these women lived in constant anxiety. They had survived childhood marriage, but adulthood offered no peace. Let's pause and talk about appearance. Queens were expected to age gracefully, or not at all. Youth was valued, fertility was praised, aging was inconvenient. Once a woman passed childbearing age, her value shifted again. She might become a respected matriarch, or she might become invisible. Some were quietly pushed aside, given religious duties, assigned to secondary residences, politely excluded from decision-making. Others leaned hard into piety, widows' veils, charitable works, church patronage. These were socially acceptable ways to remain relevant without threatening anyone. And some, rarely, retained influence through sheer force of personality. But even then, their power was precarious. Now let's gently address something history often glosses over. Many of these women had absolutely no concept of personal identity outside their assigned roles. They had never chosen their lives. They had never asked what they wanted. They had simply adapted. From childhood, they were trained to suppress preference, emotion, and resistance. Their sense of self was built entirely around obligation. So when historians ask, why didn't she resist, or why didn't she escape, the answer is very simple. She had nowhere to go, and no idea who she would be if she did. Let's float over to health, because it ties everything together. Years of early pregnancies, miscarriages, infections, and stress took a heavy toll. Many royal women suffered chronic pain, weakness, and illness. Medical treatment was minimal and often harmful. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers, charms. Mental health was not a concept. Emotional suffering was framed as spiritual failing or divine testing. And still, they were expected to smile, to host, to appear composed in portraits that would outlive them. Which brings us to legacy. When these women died, sometimes young, sometimes worn down, they were remembered selectively, praised for obedience, for piety, for producing heirs, rarely for endurance, rarely for intelligence, rarely for surviving a system designed to use them up. History likes neat narratives: good queens, bad queens, influential mothers, weak consorts. It rarely sits with the reality that many of these women were victims of a structure so normalized that suffering didn't even register as unusual. They were not tragic exceptions, they were the rule. As we drift onward, we're going to start looking at individual patterns, different regions, different courts, same outcomes. Because whether you were born in France, England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, or beyond, the rules were remarkably consistent. Born female, born noble, born useful. And on that gently unsettling note, let's continue.
In Part 4, we'll float over to the girls who never even made it this far, and the ones whose stories ended before adulthood ever really began. Let's settle back in. If you've dozed off a little and drifted back, that's perfect. This is exactly the part of the story that history itself tends to mumble through, clear its throat about, and then move on from very quickly. Because these are the girls who didn't survive long enough to become queens, regents, or dynasty mothers. They were married, they were useful, and then they were gone. And history, being history, mostly shrugged. For every famous queen whose name survived in chronicles and portraits, there were dozens, hundreds of noble girls whose lives ended quietly, early, and without much commentary. Their stories exist only in account books, marriage contracts, burial records, and the occasional painfully brief sentence like, "She died in her 14th year," which is a sentence that does a lot of work while saying almost nothing. Let's gently look at how this happened without dwelling on it too much. The most common cause, unsurprisingly, was childbirth. Girls married at 12 or 13 were often expected to conceive immediately. There was no waiting period for physical maturity, no concern for recovery. Pregnancy followed pregnancy with little pause in between. Their bodies simply couldn't handle it.
Labor could last for days, sometimes longer. Infections were common, hemorrhaging was frequent. Obstructed labor, when the baby could not pass through the pelvis, was often fatal for both mother and child. There were no surgical interventions that could reliably save them, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, just prayers, herbs, and increasingly desperate attempts to help. If the girl died, she was mourned briefly. A funeral was held, a tomb was commissioned if she was important enough, and then attention shifted to the political consequences. Was the alliance still valid? Could another marriage be arranged? Did she have a younger sister? It sounds cold, because it was. Now let's talk about illness, because childhood marriage didn't just shorten lives through childbirth, it weakened bodies already under stress. Many of these girls suffered from chronic malnutrition. Even in wealthy households, diets could be unbalanced. Add repeated pregnancies, blood loss, and emotional strain, and the immune system didn't stand a chance. Tuberculosis, fevers, infections that would be minor today but were deadly then. And when a girl fell ill, treatment often made things worse. Bloodletting was a standard response to almost everything. So if you were already weak, the solution was to remove more blood, which, unsurprisingly, did not help. Some girls were sent to convents to recover. Others were kept secluded. If they recovered, great. If not, the outcome was accepted as God's will. God was blamed for a lot of systemic problems. Let's float over to another quiet killer, despair. This one doesn't show up clearly in records, but it lingers between the lines. Girls who were removed from their families, placed in hostile courts, and subjected to constant pressure sometimes simply stopped functioning. They ate less, spoke less, withdrew. Chronic sadness wasn't recognized as an illness. It was interpreted as temperament, or stubbornness, or spiritual weakness. Some historians suspect that what we would now call depression or trauma played a role in early deaths. A body under constant stress doesn't heal well. It doesn't fight infection effectively. It doesn't survive childbirth easily. But no one at the time would have made that connection. They just noted that she was delicate, or frail, or never robust, which is a polite way of saying she never stood a chance. Now let's talk about accidents, because royal courts were not safe environments. Stone staircases, open fires, horses, heavy clothing, candle-lit corridors. A fall could be fatal, a burn could become infected, a riding accident could end everything. And when a young bride died suddenly, rumors often followed. Poison, foul play, political sabotage. Sometimes those rumors were true, sometimes they weren't. But they reveal something important.
Everyone understood that these girls existed within dangerous political systems. Their deaths were rarely just personal tragedies, they were events with consequences. Which brings us to succession anxiety. If a child bride died without producing an heir, it was a problem, a serious one. Alliances could unravel, claims could be disputed, wars could eventually trace their origins back to a marriage that failed. So while the girl herself was replaceable, the situation she represented was not. This is why sisters were often married in sequence. If the eldest daughter died, the next one stepped in, sometimes literally married to the same man, same title, same expectations. Imagine being a younger sister, watching your sibling leave for a foreign court, hearing of her illness, her death, and then being told you would take her place. Same destination, same husband, same risks. And being expected to feel honored. Now let's talk about the ones who never even reached the altar. Some girls died during betrothal periods. They were promised, negotiated over, written into treaties, and then died of illness or accident before marriage could take place. In those cases, their existence often vanished almost entirely from the record. A name crossed out, a contract amended, a new negotiation begun. They were remembered only as failed connections. Now here is a particularly unsettling detail. Because child mortality was so high, many royal families simply expected that not all daughters would survive. This wasn't discussed openly, but it shaped behavior. Girls were married young not just for political urgency, but because there was no guarantee they'd live long enough to be useful later. So marriage became a race against time. Get the alliance secured before illness, accident, or biology intervenes, which adds a strange layer of desperation to everything. Let's pause and talk about funerals. Royal funerals were elaborate: processions, prayers, black cloth, gilded tombs, carefully worded epitaphs. But even in death, these girls were presented as symbols, not people. She was virtuous. She was obedient. She was devout. Rarely, she was afraid. She was lonely. She was too young. Their youth was mentioned only as a tragic flourish, not a structural problem. Now, let's gently acknowledge something else. Some girls survived marriage and childbirth, but not long enough to enjoy any stability. They died in their late teens or early 20s, leaving behind infants who barely knew them. Those children were raised by nurses, tutors, and male relatives. Their mothers became distant memories, idealized figures in stories told later. She was gentle. She was kind. She would have been a great queen. Which is a very comforting way to avoid asking why she died at 19. History is very good at that. Now, before we move on, let's sit quietly with a single image. A royal tomb, stone effigy, a young woman carved in repose, hands folded, face calm, crown resting gently on her head. She looks peaceful, timeless, complete. But her life was none of those things. She was rushed, used, exhausted, and ended early. And the world kept going. New marriages were arranged, new girls were sent away, new alliances formed. The system did not change. As we drift toward the next part of this story, we're going to shift slightly. We'll talk about the girls who did survive childhood marriage, but never stopped paying the price for it. Women who lived long lives, but carried the consequences in their bodies, minds, and relationships.
because survival in this context didn't mean freedom, it just meant endurance. So take a slow breath, let the history wash over you, and when you're ready, we'll continue on. In Part 5, we'll float over to the long-term aftermath, what it meant to grow old after a life that began far too early. Let's ease back in again. Same slow pace, same quiet disappointment in humanity. Nothing sharp, nothing loud. By this point, our child bride has done something relatively rare for her era. She has lived, not just into adulthood, but beyond it. She has outlasted the most dangerous years: childbirth, court intrigue, political disposability. And now she is older, which in royal terms is complicated.
Growing old after a childhood marriage didn't come with relief, it came with consequences. Physical, emotional, and social consequences that lingered for decades. Let's start with the body, because history always does, whether it admits it or not. Years of early pregnancies left lasting damage, chronic pain, mobility issues, weakness, incontinence. Conditions that modern medicine could sometimes manage, but medieval medicine mostly ignored or misunderstood. Aging queens often withdrew from public appearances, not because they wanted privacy, but because moving hurt, standing hurt, riding hurt. And yet, official records might simply note that she had become less visible, or more contemplative, or increasingly devout. Because saying her body was broken by being forced to give birth at 14 would have been awkward. Now let's talk about emotional aging, which is quieter and harder to trace. Many of these women never had the chance to emotionally mature in a normal way. Their childhoods were compressed, their adolescence was erased, their adult identities were assigned. So when they reached middle age, they often experienced something like delayed self-awareness, a subtle internal reckoning. Some turned inward, became more religious, more withdrawn, more reflective. They funded monasteries, endowed churches, focused on the afterlife. Others became surprisingly assertive. With fertility no longer an issue, and husbands sometimes dead or weakened by age, older queens could suddenly speak more freely. They had survived long enough to stop being immediately disposable. This is where we occasionally see flashes of personality emerge in the records. Sharp letters, strong opinions, strategic thinking. It's tempting to see this as empowerment, and in some cases it was. But it came late, very late. Let's float over to family dynamics, because they didn't get simpler with time. Older queens were often surrounded by adult children they barely knew, sons who ruled kingdoms, daughters who had been sent away just as she had been. Relationships were formal, polite, politically cautious. A queen mother might advise her son, but only if he listened. She might influence marriages, but only within limits. She was respected, but rarely obeyed. And if she overstepped, she was reminded of her place, which, despite everything, was still secondary. Now let's talk about widows, because many women outlived their husbands. Widowhood could bring a strange mix of relief and isolation. Relief from marital expectations, isolation from relevance. Some widowed queens were granted dower lands, estates, residences. They managed households, finances, and patronage networks. This was one of the few areas where royal women could exercise sustained authority. Others were quietly sidelined, sent to secondary courts, given ceremonial roles with no real influence. They were no longer dangerous, but they were no longer useful either. And usefulness, as we've seen, was everything.
Let's pause and talk about memory. How did these women remember their own lives? We don't often know. Personal diaries were rare. Letters were filtered. Chroniclers were uninterested in inner worlds. But occasionally, something slips through. A letter expressing exhaustion, a donation to a convent with unusually personal wording, a request to be buried somewhere specific, away from the court. Small gestures, quiet choices. They suggest women who were tired, not just physically, but existentially. Women who had lived entire lives shaped by obligation and were, finally, allowed a little space to decide how they wanted to end. Now let's gently acknowledge something else. Some older queens became deeply invested in younger girls at court, nieces, ladies-in-waiting, daughters of allies. Sometimes this was kindness, protection, mentorship. Sometimes it was projection. They saw themselves in these girls, and they knew what was coming. Occasionally, an older queen tried to delay a marriage, or negotiate better conditions, or insist on education. These efforts were usually subtle, often unsuccessful, but they mattered. They were small acts of resistance in a system that did not encourage them. Now let's talk about reputation, because history has opinions. Older queens were often judged harshly. If they were assertive, they were manipulative. If they were passive, they were weak. If they were religious, they were fanatical. If they enjoyed luxury, they were indulgent. There was no correct way to age as a woman in power. Men aged into authority. Women aged out of relevance. And yet, some endured anyway. They became fixtures, institutions, background figures who had seen everything and were rarely asked about it. They attended ceremonies, offered blessings, smiled for portraits, and inside they carried decades of memories no one wanted to hear. Now let's sit with a final image for this part. An older queen sitting quietly in a private chamber. No crown, no audience, just silence. She remembers being a child, handed over to strangers. She remembers fear, pain, loss, duty. She remembers surviving things she was never supposed to question. And now, finally, she has time. Time to think, time to feel, time to rest. But not time to undo anything.
That's the quiet tragedy of longevity in this system. Living long enough to understand what was taken from you, but not long enough or free enough to change it. As we drift onward, we're going to widen the lens one last time. In the next part, we'll step back and look at how completely normalized the system was, and why it lasted as long as it did. Because these weren't isolated horrors, they were institutional habits. So let your mind relax again. Let the rhythm slow. And when you're ready, we'll continue into part 6. Let's drift back in. Same soft pace, same low expectations of historical empathy, nothing abrupt. By now, it should feel clear that none of this was accidental. Childhood political marriage wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system, carefully maintained, repeated, defended, and most importantly, normalized. Because for something this widespread to continue for centuries, it had to be considered reasonable. So let's gently unpack how everyone involved convinced themselves this was fine. First, there was tradition, which is history's favorite excuse. Royal families didn't invent child marriage anew each generation. They inherited it. They pointed backward and said, this is how it's always been done. And because the people benefiting from the system were never the children involved, no one with power had much incentive to question it. When something becomes tradition, it stops needing justification. It becomes invisible. Then there was religion. Religious authorities across Europe and far beyond it sanctioned these marriages, not always enthusiastically, but consistently. Marriage was a sacrament. Obedience was a virtue. Suffering was spiritually meaningful. If a girl struggled, she was told to pray. If she was afraid, she was told to trust God. If she died, she was said to have fulfilled her duty. Faith didn't cause the system, but it smoothed its rough edges, gave it moral cover, turned structural cruelty into spiritual endurance. And because religion touched every part of daily life, its approval mattered deeply. Now, let's talk about politics, because that's where the real momentum came from. In a world without stable nation-states, marriages were diplomacy, borders were fragile, alliances were personal. A king didn't trust treaties, he trusted bloodlines. A daughter married young meant an alliance secured early, before illness, before rebellion, before another rival marriage could intervene. Childhood wasn't sacred, it was inconvenient. So the younger the bride, the longer the alliance might last. That was the thinking: cold, practical, and tragically effective. Now let's float to something subtler: fear. Royal families lived with constant anxiety about succession, about legitimacy, about extinction. Dynasties failed all the time. A single illness, a single accident, and centuries of power could vanish. So daughters were insurance policies. Marrying them early meant fewer unknowns, fewer risks. The fact that this insurance came at the cost of the child herself was unfortunate, but acceptable. Fear makes monsters of reasonable people, and this system was built on fear. Let's pause and talk about language.
One of the reasons this practice persisted so long is because it was never described in emotionally honest terms. Girls weren't sold, they were given. They weren't forced, they were betrothed. They weren't children, they were young women. Language softened reality, made it ceremonial, made it polite. When you rename harm as duty, people stop seeing it as harm. Now, let's address the uncomfortable question history often avoids. Did anyone object? Yes, occasionally, quietly, ineffectively. Some parents hesitated, some mothers resisted, some advisors warned against extreme youth, some religious figures argued for delay. But objections were easily overridden by urgency, or politics, or money. And girls themselves? Their voices rarely mattered, even when they cried, even when they refused, even when they became ill. Children were not considered reliable narrators of their own suffering. Now let's float beyond Europe for a moment, because this wasn't unique. Across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, political child marriage existed in various forms. Different customs, different rituals, same outcome. Girls were used to secure peace, legitimacy, and loyalty. The details changed, the logic did not. Which tells us something important. This wasn't about one culture being cruel. It was about power structures repeating themselves. Wherever inheritance mattered more than individual well-being, childhood became negotiable. Now let's gently touch on one last factor: absence of alternatives. Royal women could not rule independently in most societies. They could not inherit freely. They could not choose partners. So marriage was the only available role. Without marriage, a princess had no function. Without function, she was a liability. So even families that loved their daughters often felt trapped. The system didn't just pressure girls, it pressured everyone around them, which is how injustice sustains itself. Not just through malice, but through resignation. Let's sit with that for a moment. A father signs a contract. A mother weeps quietly. A girl is dressed in silk she didn't choose. And everyone tells themselves this is necessary, because imagining a different world would require dismantling the one they depend on. Now, as we begin to drift toward the end of this long, quiet story, we'll start to see change, slowly, unevenly, reluctantly. The system doesn't collapse overnight. It never does. But cracks appear.
Ideas shift. Medicine improves. Childhood becomes something people notice. And in Part 7, we'll float toward that transition, not as a triumph, not as a clean ending, but as a gradual, imperfect turning away from a practice that had already taken too much. So let your breathing slow again. Let the history fade slightly into the background. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Let's drift back in one more time. Same low light, same steady voice, same sense that history is dragging its feet, because of course it is. By the late medieval period and into the early modern era, something subtle began to shift. Not dramatically, not heroically, just enough to be noticeable if you squint at the record long enough. The idea of childhood started to exist. Not in a modern, wholesome way. No one was talking about emotional development or consent, but people began to notice patterns, quietly, practically. Very young brides were dying. Alliances were collapsing anyway. Heirs weren't surviving as hoped. And when a system stops delivering results, even the most tradition-loving elites start to reconsider, not for moral reasons, for efficiency. Let's talk medicine first, because that's where the earliest cracks formed. Physicians began to observe, without fully understanding, that girls who married and conceived later tended to survive longer. Their children lived more often. Their bodies held up better. This wasn't framed as concern for the girl, it was framed as concern for outcomes. A 16-year-old bride was more successful than a 12-year-old one. A woman in her late teens was less likely to die in childbirth than a child. So some courts began quietly delaying consummation. Others delayed marriage itself, slightly. Not because childhood mattered, but because dead queens were inconvenient. Now let's float over to education. In certain elite circles, especially during the Renaissance, education for noble girls expanded a bit. Reading, writing, languages, religious study, occasionally philosophy. This didn't mean freedom, but it did mean awareness. Girls who could read letters, manage correspondence, and understand politics were marginally harder to treat as interchangeable objects. They still were, but with paperwork. Some educated women began leaving behind letters that hinted at dissatisfaction, fatigue, resignation, occasionally quiet resistance. Nothing revolutionary, just human. Now let's talk about reputation, because this is where things get interesting. As political thought evolved, rulers became increasingly concerned with legacy, not just power, but image. A king who married a literal child began to look bad. Not sinful, not illegal, just embarrassing. Foreign courts noticed, satirists noticed, enemies noticed, and that social pressure mattered. Slowly, the acceptable age crept upward. 13 became young. 14 became risky. 15 became preferable. 16 became respectable. Which is not a victory, but it is movement. Let's pause and acknowledge something important. The system didn't change because people suddenly cared about girls. It changed because the cost-benefit analysis shifted. That's uncomfortable, but it's honest. Now let's float into the emotional aftermath for the women who lived through this transition. Older queens, those who had been married extremely young, sometimes watched younger generations experience slightly better conditions, slightly later marriages, slightly more education, slightly more choice, and that awareness could be bittersweet. Some supported these changes, advocated quietly, negotiated harder for their daughters and nieces. Others resisted, insisting that suffering was necessary
because it had been necessary for them, a common human response. History doesn't sort trauma neatly. Now let's talk about law, because eventually it had to get involved. Gradually, minimum marriage ages were codified in some regions, not enforced consistently, often ignored, but written down. Which matters, because once something is written as a rule, it becomes possible to argue about it. And arguments are how systems unravel. But even as laws changed, practices lingered. Betrothals still happened early. Pressure still existed. Choice was still limited. The idea that a girl might refuse a marriage outright was still radical. So let's be clear. This wasn't a clean ending. It wasn't justice. It was erosion. The sharpest edges were blunted. The system softened just enough to continue existing in a new form. And many of the women who suffered under it never lived to see even that. Let's drift toward our final thoughts now. Not conclusions, just reflections. When we look back at the real lives of women sold into political marriages as children, it's tempting to search for heroes or villains, cruel fathers, evil kings, wicked courts.
But what we mostly find is structure. A machine that rewarded compliance and punished resistance. A system that valued stability over humanity. A world that normalized suffering because it was familiar. These women were not tragic exceptions. They were foundational. Their endurance built dynasties. Their bodies secured borders. Their silence made history look orderly. And because they did not scream in the records, because their pain was quiet and repetitive, it was easy to overlook. So if you take anything from this long, sleepy journey through their lives, let it be this gentle awareness. Power often looks calm. Tradition often looks harmless. And suffering doesn't need to be dramatic to be devastating. Now let your thoughts slow again. The lights are low. The story is nearly done. And somewhere in the past, a girl is being dressed for a wedding she didn't choose, while everyone around her insists this is simply how the world works. And with that quiet truth, we can finally rest.